I have buried men who were stronger than her. I have buried men who were smarter, men who could shoe a horse blind drunk, men who could read the sky like scripture. And I am telling you plain, the way I'd tell it to my own boy if he were old enough to hear it without flinching. Not one of them would have done what she did. Not one of them would have set their teeth against a thing the whole valley laughed at, and dragged it up a mountain alone, and been right when right could not save her any embarrassment, only our lives. You think you know how this story goes. A stubborn woman, a hard winter, and some lesson tied up neat at the end like a Christmas parcel. I thought I knew it too. I stood at the bottom of that ridge with my thumbs in my belt and a smirk on my face, and I helped do the laughing, God forgive me. I was wrong about her in every way a man can be wrong about another soul. So before I tell you what the ice did, and the ice did terrible things, things I still see when I close my eyes, I want you to sit with me a while at the bottom of that ridge. I want you to watch her the way we watched her. I want you to laugh if you're going to laugh, because you'll need it to spend later when there's nothing left to spend it on but grief and the long shame of having been a fool. Stay with me. This is the truest thing I know. The first time I saw Della Hartwick, she was losing. That's the honest beginning of it, and I won't dress it up, because she'd have hated me for dressing it up. She was halfway up the cutbank below the Mercer place with a length of frayed rope over her shoulder, and on the other end of that rope was the single ugliest object I have ever seen a human being love. An iron cook stove. Not a small one either, one of those big black box stoves out of a catalog, with a warming shelf and a flue collar and 4 squat legs like a hog's, and it must have weighed 300 pounds if it weighed an ounce. She had it lashed to a stone boat, which is a kind of flat sled you drag across rough ground, and she was pulling it up a grade that I wouldn't have asked a mule to climb without a fight. It was October. The aspens had already gone, the gold of them stripped off in the last big wind, and the air had that thin, clean smell that comes before the cold settles in for good. I was riding fence for the Barcross, which is the outfit I worked for going on 6 years then, and I'd cut up the draw to check a gate when I came on her. I should tell you about myself since I'm the one doing the telling and you ought to know who's holding the lantern. My name is Tom Aldous. I was 31 that autumn, a middling hand at most things and a poor hand at a few, and I had a habit my mother always despaired of, which is that I kept a little book. A tally book, the kind we used for counting cattle, except I wrote things in mine that had nothing to do with cattle. Weather. Things men said. Once I wrote down the exact color of the sky the morning my father died, because I was afraid I'd forget it and I did not want to forget it. The other hands ribbed me for it when they caught me at it, called it my diary, said it in a high voice to make it womanish. I let them. A man learns which fights to have. So when I saw Della Hartwick losing against that stove, the first thing I did before I offered help, before I even said good morning, was reach for my book. I'm not proud of that, but it's the truth, and I promised you the truth. You're going to throw your back, I said instead of hello. She didn't look up. She had her boots dug in and her whole small body leaned into the rope like a sail leaned into wind, and the stone boat had hung up on a root, and she was just holding it there, holding the whole weight of it against gravity while she figured her next move. Her hair had come loose from its pins and stuck to her face in dark strings. She was not a large woman. That's the thing I keep coming back to. She was not large, and she was not young, somewhere past 40, I judged, though it's a hard thing to judge in a person who's worked outdoors her whole life, and she was doing a thing that 2 strong men would have grunted over. If I throw my back, she said, still not looking, I'd appreciate you not telling me about it. I laughed. I couldn't help it. There was a dryness in the way she said it that caught me off guard, and the laugh was out of me before I decided to let it go. Were you taking it? I asked. Now she looked. She had pale eyes, gray or a washed-out blue, and they had a way of going still on a person, like she was reading something written on the back of your skull. Up, she said. Up where? Up there. And she tipped her head at the ridge above us, which is to say at nothing, because there was nothing up there but rock and a stand of dead lodgepole, and the old line shack that the Mercers had used back when they ran sheep, before the sheep failed and the Mercers failed with them, and the whole sorry parcel reverted to nobody in particular. It was the highest habitable thing in the valley. It was also, in the considered opinion of every living soul in that valley, the last place a sane person would choose to spend a winter. "The Mercer shack," I said. "It has a name," she said. "I've been calling it home." I want you to understand the shape of the thing she was proposing, because it matters to everything that comes after. The valley we lived in was a long high cup of land in the territory, ringed by mountains, with the town of Quitman down at the low end where two creeks came together. Most folks who wintered in that country wintered low. You got down out of the wind, down where the cold pooled less mean, down near other people who could dig you out if the snow came hard. Going up for the winter, going up to a derelict shack on the most exposed shoulder of the whole basin, was the kind of thing that, when word of it reached town, made men set down their coffee and shake their heads slow. And word had reached town. That was the part I didn't yet know, standing there in the draw. By the time I met her on the cutbank, Della Hartwick had already been the subject of 3 weeks of Quitman's amusement. Here is what the town knew or thought it knew. She'd come in on the spring stage. A widow, that word did a lot of work, widow. It explained a woman traveling alone and saved everybody the trouble of curiosity. And she'd paid cash money to file on the abandoned Mercer parcel, which nobody else wanted because nobody else was a fool. She kept to herself. She bought strange things at the mercantile and bought them in a strange order. Lamp oil by the case, salt by the hundredweight, coil after coil of stovepipe, beans, flour, cornmeal, lard more than one woman could eat in a year, hauled up that ridge load by load on a borrowed mule and her own 2 arms. And then, the week before I met her, she'd bought the stove. The stove was the thing that tipped it from oddity into legend. The old stove in the Mercer shack worked fine, was the common wisdom, drew a little but worked. There was no earthly reason to freight a 300-pound iron monster up a goat track when a working stove already sat in the room, except she'd looked at the old one and pronounced it cracked through the firebox, said it'd let carbon monoxide kill her in her sleep some still cold night, and she would not have it. You may think that sounds reasonable. It does now. It did not then. Then it sounded like a woman who decided the perfectly good stove she had was secretly murdering her, which is the kind of thing folks say about people they've already decided are touched. So they laughed. Lord, how they laughed. At Prout's store the men did impressions of her, this small grave woman with her case of lamp oil, intoning about murder by stove. Somebody started calling her the stove widow, and it stuck the way cruel names stick, faster than kind ones ever do. And the worst of it, the part I am most ashamed to set down, is that I laughed too. I'd heard the stories before I ever laid eyes on her. So when I came on her in the draw, losing to that stove, I came already armed with the town's verdict, and I held it up between us like a man holds a lamp, and I let it color everything I saw. "You can't make that grade alone," I told her. "Not with that load. You'll get it halfway and it'll slide on you and you'll go down the bank with it." "I made the bottom half alone," she said. "The bottom half's the easy half." "Then I'll be glad I did the easy half first." She wound the rope tighter around her forearm, the way you do when you mean to take strain. "Are you going to help, or are you going to narrate?" That stung, because narrating is exactly what I'd been doing, and she'd seen it, and she'd named it. I sat my horse a second longer than my pride should have allowed. Then I got down. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to tell this part so I come off well, and I didn't come off well. I helped her, yes, but I helped her the way you help a child do a thing you're certain is foolish, humoring, half laughing. Sure, I'd be proven right within the hour and we'd both have a good story out of it. I put my shoulder to the back of the stone boat and she leaned into the rope, and we worked that stove off the root and up over the lip of the cutbank, and the whole time some part of me was just waiting. Waiting for her to give out. Waiting for the slide, the spill, the moment I could say I told you in a kind voice, and offer to haul the thing back down to where it belonged. The moment didn't come. We got it over the lip. We got it across the bench above and onto the steeper grade, and there she stopped me. "I've got it from here," she said. "You don't." "I do." She wiped her face with the back of her wrist, leaving a smear of dirt across one cheekbone. She was breathing hard. There was a tremor in her arms that she was working to hide and not quite hiding. "I know how this looks. I've known how it looks since the day I bought the lamp oil. You can go on back and tell them at Prout's that the stove widow's lost the last of her sense and you helped her part way up the hill out of Christian charity, and then you washed your hands of it. They'll laugh. You'll laugh. And it'll be a true story, every word." I didn't say anything. There wasn't a clean thing to say. "But I'm going to ask you one thing first," she went on, "and I'd be obliged if you'd answer me straight, because I can't tell from your face whether you're a thinking man or just a polite one." She set the rope's tension and turned to face me full on. "What does the sky tell you about this winter?" It was a strange question, and it caught the edge of the strangest part of me, the part that kept the book, that wrote down the color of the sky. I almost lied. I almost gave her the easy townsman answer, cold like always, "Ma'am, what do I know?" But there was something in those still gray eyes that wanted a real answer, and I am, when it comes down to it, a man who'd rather be honest than comfortable. "The geese went early," I said. 3 weeks early, and high. They were flying high and hard south while the weather was still soft, which my father always said meant they'd been pushed off something behind them. The muskrats up on Beaver Slough built their lodges out farther from the bank than I've ever seen, like they knew the water'd come up and freeze deep. The cattle are putting on coat faster than a normal year. I stopped. I felt foolish saying it, the way I'd felt foolish 100 times saying true things that couldn't be proved. "I think it's going to be a bad one. I haven't said so to anybody because saying so doesn't change the price of beef. But you asked. So, I think it's going to be a bad one." For the first time, something moved behind her stillness. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the look of a person who has been alone with a worry for a long time and has just heard another human voice say the same worry out loud. "So do I," she said quietly. "So do I, Mr. Aldous, Tom Aldous. Mr. Aldous, I think it's going to be the kind of winter this country tells stories about for 50 years. I've seen it come on before in another place in another life, and I watched it take people who laughed at the woman buying lamp oil." She turned back to the rope. "I'm not going up that mountain to be alone with a stove. I'm going up to be ready. There's a difference, and it's the whole difference, and not one soul in Quitman can see it. You don't have to see it either. But don't tell me I can't make the grade. I'm going to make the grade. I've made harder grades than this, carrying heavier things than iron." And then she leaned into the rope, and the stone boat scraped forward, and she went on up the mountain without me. I sat my horse a long while and watched her climb. I want to tell you I went after her. I didn't. I told myself she'd refused my help, which was true, and that a man's got no business forcing aid on a grown woman who's told him plain to go, which is also true, and underneath both of those true things was the smaller, meaner truth that I was still half convinced she was a fool, and I didn't want to be a fool's accomplice in front of God and the geese. So I rode back down the draw. I finished my fence. That evening at the bunkhouse I told the story, not cruel I'd like to think, but I told it, the stove widow and her 300-pound iron certainty, and the boys laughed, and I let them. And Cal Brennan said, "Did you get her name?" And I said, "Della Hartwick," and Cal said, "Well, here's to the widow Hartwick. May her stove keep her warm and her wits keep her company, since nothing else will." And we all drank to that. We drank to that. But I'd written something in my book that afternoon. After she went up the hill, before I rode down, I'd taken it out and I'd written 4 words, and I didn't show them to anybody at the bunkhouse, and I didn't say them out loud. She asked the right question. That was all. She asked the right question. Because it had snagged on me, you see, the difference between a fool and a person who is simply early. A fool buys lamp oil for no reason. A person who is early buys lamp oil because she has done a piece of arithmetic the rest of us are too comfortable to do. And the only way to tell those two people apart is to wait and see whether the thing they were early for arrives. Everyone in Quitman had decided not to wait. They'd skipped straight to the verdict because the verdict was funnier and easier and let them feel clever at no cost. And I'd gone along, because going along is the warmest place there is, right up until it isn't. I didn't go up the mountain, but I started watching the sky harder. I started writing the geese down and the muskrats and the coats on the cattle, and the way the first frost in November came 2 weeks early and didn't lift by noon the way early frosts are supposed to. I told myself I was just keeping my tally. I wasn't. I was checking her arithmetic against mine. I was, though I'd have died before admitting it at Prout's, waiting to find out whether the stove widow was a fool or a prophet. The cold came down in stages, the way real cold does, not in one drama but in a long tightening. First the frost that wouldn't lift, then the creeks skinning over at the edges, the ice creeping toward the middle a little farther each still night. Then the day in late November when the wind swung around to the north and stayed there, and the temperature dropped through the morning instead of rising, and old Hoke Prout himself, who'd lived in that valley longer than anybody, stood in the door of his store and looked at the sky and said nothing at all, which from Hoke was as good as a scream. The laughing didn't stop, but it changed. It got a little thinner, a little quicker, the way laughter does when underneath it people have started to wonder. Twice that month I heard the stove widow's name come up at the store and nobody quite finished the joke. Somebody'd start it, the stove widow, up there with her, and then trail off, and there'd be a small silence, and then somebody'd change the subject to the price of feed. I rode past the bottom of her ridge more than once on Barcross business. I could see smoke from the shack on the cold mornings. A good clean column of smoke, drawing straight up in the still air, which is the smoke of a stove that's seated right in a fire that's tended by somebody who knows how. I never saw her. But I saw that smoke, and I'd sit my horse and look at it the way you look at a candle in a far window, and I'd think about the difference between being alone and being ready, and how she'd said it was the whole difference, and how I was beginning to believe her. I should have gone up. I had 100 chances and a fast horse and no good reason, and I should have gone up that mountain and knocked on her door and said, "You asked the right question, ma'am, and I've been keeping your arithmetic, and I think you're right." I should have, because of what came after, because of what the ice did, because by the time the rest of us understood what she'd understood in October, the understanding cost more than any of us had to pay, and some of us paid it anyway. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and she'd have hated that too. She had no patience for a man who couldn't tell a thing in its order. So let me stop here, at the candle in the far window, at the clean smoke drawing straight up in the cold, still air, with the whole valley still mostly laughing and the geese long gone and my little book filling up with weather. Let me stop here, because the next part is the storm, and I need both hands free to tell it. It started as rain. That was the trick of it, the cruelty of it. The thing that killed people who'd survived 100 honest snowstorms. It started as rain in the second week of December, a warm, wet wind out of the southwest that everyone in Quitman took as a mercy. We'd had 3 weeks of that tightening cold, the creeks frozen bank to bank, the stock huddled and miserable, and then this soft gray rain came in and the temperature climbed and men stood in their doorways with their hats off and let it fall on their faces and said, "Well, maybe it won't be such a winter after all." I want you to hear how badly we wanted that to be true. We wanted it so badly that we mistook the rain for the end of something when it was the beginning. The whole valley exhaled. At Prout's they talked about an early thaw. Cal Brennan made a joke about the stove widow freighting all that lamp oil up a mountain for a winter that wasn't coming, and this time the whole store laughed, big and easy and relieved, because if the winter wasn't coming then she really had been a fool after all and we could stop wondering. I didn't laugh. I'd been keeping my book. The rain was warm, but it was falling on ground that was froze 3 feet down, and I knew what that meant even if I couldn't have said it in words a townsman would respect. I rode home to the bunkhouse that evening with the rain running off my hat brim, and I took out my book under the lamp and I wrote, "Rain on frozen ground. This is wrong. This is the worst thing." And Cal looked over my shoulder and said, "Tom, you'd find a funeral in a wedding." And I said maybe, and put the book away. The temperature broke at midnight. I know it was midnight because the cold woke me. Not gradually, all at once, the way a sound wakes you, except it was the absence of sound, the rain on the roof gone silent between one breath and the next. I lay there in the dark and listened to the silence and felt the cold come down through the bunkhouse like water filling a well, and I knew. I got up and went to the window and scraped the fog off the glass with my thumb, and there was nothing to see, just black, but I could hear it now. A faint, continuous, crackling tick. Like the whole world was made of green wood and somebody'd set it all very gently alight. It was the rain freezing where it fell. The wind had swung north again while we slept, swung north and dropped the temperature 30 degrees in an hour, and every drop of that warm, soft mercy rain was turning to ice the instant it touched anything, the roofs, the rails, the bare black branches, the long dead grass, the backs of the cattle standing miserable in the open. By morning it had a name, though we didn't have the word for it then the way they have words for things now. We just called it the ice. The big ice, later, to tell it apart from the smaller ones that came after in other years. The ice that everybody who lived through it measured the rest of their life against before the ice, after the ice. When the gray light finally came up, it came up on a world made of glass. I have tried many times to describe it to people who weren't there, and I always fail, and I'll fail again now, but I have to try because it matters. Imagine every single thing you can see coated in ice a half-inch thick, then an inch, then more. The fence wire was rope thick with it. The trees, God, the trees. The big cottonwoods down along the creek were so loaded that they'd begun to come apart, and all through that first day you'd hear them go. A long groaning crack and then a roar and crash as a limb the size of a man's body tore loose and came down, taking 100 pounds of ice with it. The lodgepoles up on the ridges snapped clean off, whole stands of them, the sound rolling across the valley like distant cannon. You couldn't walk. The ground was a sheet. Horses went down and couldn't get up and broke their legs trying. And it kept raining and it kept freezing, and the ice kept getting thicker, hour after hour after hour, and there was nothing any of us could do but stand at our windows and watch the world be slowly crushed. The Barcross lost 40 head the first day. Not to cold, though the cold would have done it given time, to the ice itself. The cattle had drifted with the warm rain down into the cottonwood bottoms for shelter, the way cattle will, and when the trees started coming down the cattle were under them, and we couldn't get to them across that glass to drive them out, and we stood up on the high ground and watched the timber fall on our stock, and we could not do one thing about it. I have never felt so useless in my life as I felt that first morning. A grown man, 6 years a hand, strong and capable, reduced to a spectator at the destruction of everything he was supposed to protect. That was when I first thought of her, of Della Hartwick up on the most exposed shoulder of the whole basin, alone. And I thought she's dead. I thought it with a sick lurch, a real grief surprising in its size. She's up there alone in the worst of it, in a derelict shack, and she's dead, and the last thing we ever did to her was laugh. I didn't know yet how wrong I was. I didn't know yet that of all the souls in that valley, she was very nearly the only one who was ready. The second day was worse, because on the second day the dying started in earnest, and it was people now, not just stock. The way it worked, the way the ice killed, was patient and indirect, and that was its horror. It didn't kill you with cold the way a blizzard does, fast and clean. It killed you by taking away, one at a time, every single thing you needed to live, and leaving you alive long enough to understand what was happening. First it took the wood. A man's woodpile, however big, was now a single block of ice with sticks frozen inside it, and you could not split frozen wood, and you could not pry the pieces apart, and the standing timber you might have cut was either down already or so iced it'd kill you to fell it. So the fire started going out. All over the valley, in cabins and soddies and the good frame houses in town, the fires went out. because a fire eats wood and there was no wood a man could get to. And once your fire's out in that kind of cold, your house turns into an icebox with you inside it. Then it took the water. The creeks were froze solid, the wells were iced over, and you can't melt ice without a fire, and the fires were going out. People got thirsty in the middle of all that frozen water. It sounds impossible. It was true. Then it took the way out. The roads were glass. A horse couldn't keep its feet. A wagon was a death sentence, and a man on foot in that cold, slipping and falling every few yards, wouldn't make a mile before the cold took him through his sweat. Whole families that might have gotten to town, gotten to help, gotten to each other, were sealed up in their houses by a quarter-inch of ice on the ground as surely as if someone had bricked the doors. We learned all this slow, in pieces, over the days that followed, because the same ice that was killing people kept the rest of us from knowing it until too late. But I learned the first piece on the second day, and I learned it from the smoke. I'd gone up to the high pasture at first light, crawling, half of it, on hands and knees across the glass to check the stock we had left, and from up there I could see most of the valley laid out below me, white and gray and glittering and terrible in the flat morning light. And I looked, the way I'd taken to looking, for the chimneys, for the smoke, because smoke meant a fire, and a fire meant somebody alive and warm. There was almost none. The whole valley that should have had 50 columns of good morning smoke standing up in the still air, and there were maybe a dozen, and even those looked thin and failing, the smoke of fires burning the last of something. The Garrett place, no smoke. The Olafsons, who had 4 children, no smoke. The 2 soddies down on the flat where the Bohemian families had filed, no smoke. House after house after house, cold and silent and white. And I stood up there on the glass with the wind cutting through me, and I understood, all at once and far too late, exactly what was happening down there in all those silent houses. And then I lifted my eyes to the ridge, to the most exposed shoulder of the whole basin, to the Mercer shack. And there was smoke. Not thin smoke, not failing smoke. A good clean strong column of it, white-gray and straight up in the still cold air, the smoke of a hot fire well tended, the smoke of a stove seated right and drawing right and burning fuel that somebody had laid by in plenty before the warm rain ever fell. The highest, coldest, most exposed, most laughed, at house in the entire valley, and it was the warmest light in all that frozen dark. I stood up there a long time and looked at that smoke, and I'm not ashamed to say my eyes ran, and it wasn't all the wind. She'd known. That was what the smoke said. That was what the smoke had been saying all along, every morning since October, and I'd been too much a coward to read it. She'd done the arithmetic the rest of us were too comfortable to do, and she'd bought the lamp oil and the salt and the flour and the cracked firebox replacement stove, not because she was a fool with a fixation, but because she had looked at the geese and the muskrats and the early frost and concluded, alone and against the whole laughing weight of Quitman, that the winter coming was the kind that killed, and she had spent every cent and every ounce of strength she had making herself ready for it. The stove most of all. The stove she dragged up that mountain alone while we watched and laughed. The stove was the heart of all of it. Because the old Mercer stove, the one she'd been mocked for replacing, the one everybody said worked fine, I learned later it had a cracked firebox just like she'd said, and a flue half-choked with the leavings of years, and it threw heat poorly and threw poison gas besides, and a person trying to survive the ice on that stove, burning hard for days, would either freeze when it couldn't keep up or die in their sleep when it backed up its smoke into a sealed room. She'd looked at that stove in October and seen the still cold night 3 months ahead when it would have killed her, and she'd refused it. And she'd spent everything to drag a sound one up a goat track, and she had been right. She had been right about all of it, and being right had not won her one single thing except her own life, and the contempt of every neighbor she had. I made a decision up there on the high pasture in the wind, looking at her smoke. It was the heaviest decision I have ever made, and I want to be honest about how it weighed, because it would be easy to tell it as if it were simple, and it was not simple. I had the only thing in that valley that could move across the glass. Down at the bar cross, we'd been rough-shoeing horses with borium-pointed shoes for the ice, sharp-caulked, we called them. Shoes with hardened studs that bit into the ice the way a man's hobnails bite. And we had 2 horses done up that way, and they could keep their feet on ground that put any other animal down. And I had a notion, looking at that smoke, of what one man with an ice-shod horse and the only warm stove in the valley might do. But here was the weight of it. To do it, I'd have to choose. I couldn't get to everyone. There were silent, cold houses scattered across 10 miles of glass, and the days were short, and the ice was still falling, and every hour out in it was an hour closer to my own death. I could maybe reach a handful of those houses before the cold took the people in them, and I'd have to choose which. I'd have to ride past one family to reach another, knowing the ones I rode past might not be alive when help finally came, and knowing it was my passing by that helped kill them. And the warm place, the place to bring them, there was only one, up on the ridge in the shack we'd all laughed at behind the stove she'd carried alone. I did not even know if she'd open the door. I'll tell you what I did, and I'll tell it plain, and you can judge me, because I've judged myself enough that one more judge won't matter. I rode for the Olofsons first, 4 children. That was my arithmetic, cold and simple as hers had been. 4 children weighed more than 2 grown folks, and the Olofson place was no smoke and 4 children. And so I rode for it past the Garrett place, which was also no smoke, and I did not stop at the Garretts, and old Amos Garrett and his wife were both dead by the time anybody reached them, and I have to live with the fact that I rode past their door to spend my hours where I thought they'd save the most lives. I think I chose right. I will never be sure I chose right. That's the thing nobody tells you about a heavy decision, that choosing right and being at peace are 2 different things, and you only get the one. The ride to the Olofsons should have taken 20 minutes, and it took 2 hours. The borium shoes bit and held, but the horse was terrified, trembling, blowing, and twice we went down anyway, and twice I got him up, and the cold was a living thing that pushed into every gap in my clothing and pride. When I got to the door, I had to break the ice off it to open it, and inside. I won't dwell on inside. The fire was long out. They were all alive, the 6 of them, bundled together in the one bed under everything they owned. The mother had done that, had stripped the whole house of cloth and built a nest of it and put her 4 children in the middle and her own body on the outside, which is what you do, which is the oldest arithmetic there is, and they were alive, but they were going. The littlest, the baby, was the worst. Sina Olofsson looked at me in the doorway like I was something out of a fever, and she didn't ask who I was or why I'd come. She just said, in a voice with almost nothing left in it, "My bobbies." I got them out. I won't tell all of how. It took the rest of the daylight, and it nearly killed the horse, and it nearly killed me. But I got them onto and around that ice-shod horse, and I led it up off the flat and up the long, terrible grade toward the one column of smoke in the whole White Valley. And the closer we got, the more I dreaded the door, because I did not know, I truly did not know, whether the woman we'd laughed at would open it to the people who'd laughed. It was full dark when I got the Olofsons to the foot of her ridge, and the climb up the goat track in the dark on the ice with a half-dead horse and 6 freezing people was the hardest single thing I've done before or since, and I'm not going to make it sound like anything but what it was, which was an hour of small, desperate animal effort with no nobility in it at all. The baby had stopped crying somewhere down on the flat, and I was afraid of what that meant. Sina Olofsson had stopped talking. The cold up there was beyond anything I'd ever felt, a dry, murderous, still cold, and the wind that the ridge caught full would peel the skin off your face. I got to the door. There was light leaking gold around the edges of it. There was heat, I could feel it, a faint, impossible warmth bleeding out through the gaps, the first warmth I'd touched in 2 days, and I could smell wood smoke, and God help me, I could smell beans, somebody cooking beans, the most ordinary smell in the world, and it nearly broke me to smell it after the white, dead silence of all those other houses. I beat on the door with my frozen fist, and I called out. I didn't even know what I called my own name, The Olafsons' names, children, there's children. And there was a silence on the other side that lasted about 100 years. Then the bar scraped, and the door came open, and there she stood with a lamp in her hand and her gray eyes going still on me, the way they had in the draw in October, reading the back of my skull. And behind her was a room so warm the air shimmered, and the great black iron stove squatting in the middle of it, glowing, its sides ticking with heat. The stove she'd carried up that mountain alone while I sat my horse and watched and did not help, and I could not say a word. I just stepped aside so she could see what was on the horse. She looked at the Olafsons. She looked at the 4 children and the failing mother and the baby that wasn't crying. She looked, for 1/2 second, at me, and there was no triumph in it. No, I told you so, nothing of the kind, and the lack of it shamed me worse than any reproach could have. "Bring them in," she said. "The baby first, quick now, quick, and then go back down, there's more of them out there. You and I both know there's more." And she set her lamp down and reached up her 2 thin arms, the same arms that had leaned into that rope against 300 pounds of iron, and lifted the Olafson baby down off the horse and into the warmth. And that, I have come to think, is the truest picture I have of the whole thing, not the laughing at the bottom of the ridge. This. A small grave woman in a doorway, alone and ready and right, holding out her arms in the dark for the child of people who had called her a fool, while behind her the stove she'd been mocked for carrying held back the cold from the only warm room in a dying valley. I went back down. She'd told me to, and she was right, and I went. But that's the next part. That's where it gets harder and where the cost gets counted, and where I have to tell you what the ice took even from the ones who were ready, because being right saved the valley in the end near enough. It did not save her, and I need to gather myself before I tell that, the way I needed both hands free for the storm. So let me stop here, in the warm doorway, with the baby passing from my frozen arms to hers, and the stove glowing behind her, and the long ride back down into the dark still ahead of me. We ran that ridge for 4 days. I say we now, and I mean it, because by the second night it had stopped being one man and one ice-shod horse and become a thing we built between us, Della Hartwick and me, without ever once sitting down to plan it. I'd come up out of the dark with whoever I'd been able to reach, and she'd take them in, and while she worked over them, and Lord, could that woman work, I'll come to that, I'd warm myself 10 minutes by the great black stove, just long enough to stop shaking, and drink whatever was hot, and then she'd look at me with those still gray eyes and say who's left out there, and I'd tell her, and I'd go back down. We never decided I'd keep going. She never asked me to be brave. She just kept asking who's left over and over in that flat, plain voice, and the question did the work that no speech could have done, because each time she asked it I understood again that there were people in the dark who'd die if I sat by the fire, and I'd get up. I have thought since that this was her great gift, greater even than her foresight. She knew how to ask a person the one question that left them no comfortable place to stand. The shack was not big. It had been built for 2 herders and a winter of sheep, 1 room with a loft, and by the 3rd day she had 19 people in it. 19. The Olafsons, 6. The Bohemian families off the flat, the Havlicics and the Noviks, 11 souls between them, who I'd reached on the 2nd day half frozen in a soddy with their fire 2 days dead. The widow Tate, who lived alone past the church, and whom nobody had thought of until I thought of her. An old woman so light I carried her up the ridge across my saddle bow like a sack of meal, and she swore at me the whole way in a language I think was the Gaelic, and I have never been so glad to be sworn at. 19 people in 1 room built for 2, and the stove in the middle of it holding them all alive. That was the thing she'd understood that the rest of us, even the ones who survived, never fully grasped until it was over. A blizzard you outlast by hunkering down, each family alone behind its own door, riding out the cold in its own house. But the ice didn't work that way. The ice took every house all at once, took the wood and the water and the road, and the only way through it was together, everyone packed into the one place that still had heat, sharing it, breathing each other's warm air, melting snow for water on the one good stove and passing the cup hand to hand around the room. She'd seen that in October. She'd bought flour by the hundredweight not because she meant to eat it all but because, I came to understand, some part of her had always known that if the bad winter came, she would not be sitting up there alone behind her good stove eating her good food while the valley died below her. She'd laid in supplies for a crowd because she'd half expected a crowd. She'd been getting ready, the whole time, to save the very people who were laughing at her for it. I don't think she could have told you that in October. I don't think it was a plan exactly. I think it was something deeper than a plan, something in the grain of her, the same thing that made her lean into that rope against 300 pounds of iron rather than admit a grade was too steep. She was a person who got ready. It was simply what she was. And the valley had mistaken it for foolishness, because the valley had never in its comfortable life had to be ready for anything. She did not sleep. I want that set down because no one who wasn't in that room would believe it. For days, and I never once saw Della Hartwick sleep. She tended the stove. It could not be let go cold, not for 10 minutes, not with 19 people depending on it, and she fed it and banked it and nursed it with a watchfulness that never broke. She melted the snow and rationed the water. She doled out the food, a little at a time, fair, the children first and then the old and then the rest and herself last, and I am not certain I ever saw her eat at all. She set the frostbit hands and feet. The Havlicek boy lost 2 toes and would have lost the foot if she hadn't known what to do, and she knew, she'd seen it before in that other place, that other life she never named. She held the Olafson baby through the worst of the second night, the baby that had stopped crying, and she walked it and warmed it against her own body by the stove and would not give it up, and the baby lived. The baby lived. Sina Olafson named that child after her later. Della Olafson. There's a Della Olafson in this valley to this day, a grown woman with children of her own, and she does not know, none of them quite know, how close it came in that warm, crowded room on the ridge. By the 4th day, the ice was letting go. It didn't break with the rain the way you'd think. It broke with sun. The wind swung at last out of the south for true, and the sun came out hard and white over a glittering, ruined world, and you could hear the whole valley begin to drip and crack and slide as the ice gave up its grip an inch at a time. The cottonwood stopped falling. The glass went soft underfoot. And word began to move again. Men got out, got to horses, got to town, and the count began, the terrible count, who was gone and who was spared. The valley lost 31 people to the ice. I've seen the number written wrong in places since, smaller, the way a town will shave a grief down to a size it can carry. It was 31. The Garretts that I rode past, a hired man of the Barcrosses I never knew well, caught out in it. The Pedersen family, all of them found together. Old folks alone in cold houses. 31 in a valley of maybe 300 souls in 4 days. And up on the ridge, in the shack we'd laughed at, behind the stove she'd carried alone 19 people who should have been among the dead, and were not. 19 and the baby and me. 21, if you count me, and I count myself, because I'd have died out on that glass the first day if there hadn't been a warm place to come back to between rides. She didn't just save the 19. She saved the man who carried the 19. She saved more lives than any soul in the history of that valley before or since, and she did it alone, with iron and foresight and a strength that did not match her size, and she did it for people who, 3 weeks before, had a cruel name for her and laughed when they said it. Here is the part I have put off telling. When the ice broke and the men got up to the ridge, and they came, by God they came, on foot and horseback across the softening glass, the same men who'd laughed at Proots, come to fetch their neighbors home. They found those 19 people alive and warm, and they found me half dead and asleep at last in the corner, and they found the great black stove still ticking, and they found Della Hartwick sitting in the chair beside it with the Olafson baby in her arms. And they thought at first that she was only resting. She wasn't. She'd given the last of it. There's no other way I know to say it. She had not slept and barely eaten for 4 days, had spent every ounce she had keeping that stove and those 19 lives, and somewhere in the last night, with the worst already behind her and the sun about to come, with the baby safe in her arms and the room full of breathing she'd saved, somewhere in there, quiet, without a sound that woke a soul, she had simply let go. Her heart, the doctor said later when there finally was a doctor, just stopped, worn through. She was warm to the touch still when they found her from the stove. They thought she was sleeping. We all wanted her to be sleeping. The baby was fine. She kept the baby warm with the last of her own warmth, and that is not a figure of speech. That is the literal fact of how it was, and I have never been able to make my peace with the size of it. I have gone back in my mind 10,000 times to the bottom of that ridge in October, to my own smirk, to the laugh that was out of me before I decided to let it go, to Cal Brennan's toast in the bunkhouse, may her stove keep her warm and her wits keep her company, since nothing else will, and how we all drank to it, how I drank to it. We were not cruel people. That's the thing I most need you to understand, and the thing I can least make sense of. We were ordinary, decent people, the kind who came when the ice broke and carried our neighbors home, and we laughed at a woman because she frightened us. Because she'd looked at the soft October sky and seen the thing we didn't want to see, and rather than look at it ourselves, we made her foolish for looking. It is so much easier to laugh at the person who's ready than to do the frightening arithmetic yourself. I know that now. I knew it, a little, even then. I wrote she asked the right question in my book and hid it from the bunkhouse, and knowing it didn't stop me. That's the part I can't get past. I half knew, and I laughed anyway, because the laughing was warm and the truth was cold. And a man will choose the warm thing nearly every time, right up until the night the warm thing is a stove on a ridge and he's the one out on the glass. They buried her in the spring when the ground gave. The whole valley came. There were more people at the grave of the stove widow than at any funeral that valley ever held, and I stood at the back where I belonged, and I listened to men who'd done impressions of her at Prout stand up and call her the savior of the valley, which she was, and not one of them could look me in the eye, because they knew that I knew what they'd been saying in the fall, and I knew that they knew, and there was a kind of agreement in all of us not to speak of it. We were going to make her a hero. It's what a valley does. It's easier than making yourself a fool. We were going to tell it as the story of the brave woman who saw it coming and saved us all, and leave out the 3 weeks of laughing, leave out the name we called her, leave out that she died alone-ish in a crowd of the people who'd mocked her, having given them every last thing she had. I have let them tell it that way for a long time. I'm old now telling you this, and most of the men who laughed at Prout's are under the ground themselves, and the valley remembers Della Hartwick as a hero and has forgotten almost entirely that it ever called her anything else. And maybe that's right. Maybe the kindest thing memory does is sand the cruelty off and keep the brave part. I don't know. I've never been sure. But I kept my book. I kept the page from October, she asked the right question, and I kept every page after, the geese and the muskrats and the rain on frozen ground, the whole arithmetic that she did out loud to herself in the mercantile buying lamp oil, and that I did in secret in my tally book and was too much a coward to say. And when they wanted to put up a stone and asked what it should say, and the men wanted savior of the valley or some such, I was the one who said no. I said it plain, and they let me, because by then I'd earned the right to one stubborn word at her grave. It says only her name, and the dates, and underneath, 3 words I chose and would not be argued out of. She got ready. That's all. The people who need to understand it will understand it, and the people who don't, won't, and she'd have had no patience for explaining it to either. She got ready while we laughed. She got ready when getting ready cost her everything and won her nothing but our contempt. And when the night came that the rest of us were not ready for, the night the warm rain turned to glass and the fires went out across the whole valley, and the only heat in all that frozen dark was a stove on a ridge, she opened her door and held out her arms and gave it all away. I still ride past the bottom of that ridge sometimes. The shack's long gone, fell in years back, but you can find the place. And every so often, on a still cold morning early in a hard winter, I'll stop the horse and look up at where the smoke used to stand, that clean, strong column drawing straight up in the windless air, the candle in the far window that I was too slow to read. The stove's still up there. Did you know that? They never could move it back down 300 pounds of iron up a goat track, and after the ice nobody had the heart to try, and so it just stayed, rusting now, sunk in the grass where the shack came down around it. Children go up sometimes on a dare to see the widow's stove. They don't know the half of it. They think it's just a strange old thing on a mountain. I went up last fall. My knees aren't what they were, and it took me the better part of a morning, but I went up, and I sat down in the grass next to all that rust, and I took out my book, the same old book, near full now, and I read her the page from October. Out loud. I don't know why. I'm an old fool, and there was no one to hear me. No one at all up there but the wind and the iron and the long view down over the valley she saved. I read it to her, and I sat a while, and the geese were going over high and early, the way they go before a hard one. I should tell her she was right. I should have told her 60 years ago in the draw, when I had the chance and chose the warm thing instead.